Don't clap, I haven't done anything yet. How many of you here are under the age of 35? This may seem like a ridiculous question, since game developers tend to be fairly hip, but I do have to ask. I've been surprised before. Is there anybody here who does not know who Paul McCartney is? Good. I was 12 years old when the events I am about to describe to you took place. I'll be rattling off dates and places and naming names. In a few minutes, you'll see and hear everything you need to become a minor expert on this strange little episode in the history of mass communications. But there's something else I want to communicate as well. Something you can only learn from an eyewitness. I want you to know what it felt like to be almost a teenager in late October of 1969. I want you to know how it felt to be talking about this on the school bus and in the cafeteria of my junior high, huddling with friends at night around our record players, poring over our album covers, wondering, staying up late with our parents to see what they would say on the 11 o'clock news. One of our heroes was missing. Some people were saying he was dead. The world's most beloved band, ambassadors of truth and love in an age of endless war and assassination, had been caught in a monstrous lie. And their records, so full of joy and playfulness, had become the ever-present messengers of a creepy conspiracy. It was Halloween, and we were really scared. You may be wondering why anyone would make such a fuss over the bass player in a rock band. For those of you who did not raise your hands a minute ago, you probably already know the reason. For the rest of you, it isn't too easy to explain. You see, this just wasn't any bass player. And this was no ordinary band.
Ladies and gentlemen, the Beatles!
Find actual imbalance. The Watusi. The twist. Take this, brother, made certain well.
Nobody knows where or when the rumor began. The earliest printed record of a Paul is Dead story appears in the February 1967 issue of Beatles Book Monthly, the magazine of the official Beatles fan club. It contains a one-paragraph article entitled False Rumor.
The 7th of January was very icy, with dangerous conditions on the M1 motorway linking London with the Midlands, and towards the end of the day, a rumour swept London that Paul McCartney had been killed in a car crash on the M1. But of course, there was absolutely no truth in it at all, as the Beatles press officer found out when he telephoned Paul's St John's Wood home and was answered by Paul himself.
Speculation that Paul had been killed and then secretly replaced in late 1966 circulated around London during much of 1967. McCartney himself alluded to this rumor during a Beatles press conference in May of '67. And a subsequent article in the New York Times recounts an incident in which the reporter at a London party in fall of '66, heard the Paul is dead legend being joked about in his presence. At this point, the trail of documentation goes completely cold. Then, 2 years later, the rumor surfaced again, this time in Des Moines, Iowa. On Wednesday, September 17, 1969, the student newspaper at Drake University published an article by sophomore Ted Harper entitled, "Is Beatle Paul McCartney Dead?" Less than a week later, on the 23rd, the student paper at Northern Illinois University plagiarized Harper's article. Then the rumors spread to Ohio Wesleyan University, where it came to the attention of an art student named John Summer. John became so intrigued with the rumor that he compiled a dossier of evidence, supposedly proving Paul's death, and offered it to United Press International. They agreed to carry the story, but nobody paid any attention at first. For 2 weeks, the rumor gained momentum on the college campuses of Middle America. Then, on the afternoon of October 12th, the story attained critical mass. At this point, I'm going to allow the actual participants and perpetrators to tell their own story. But before I do, I need to explain the source of the audio you are now about to hear. During the climax of the Paul is Dead media frenzy, RKO produced a 1-hour television special called Paul McCartney, the complete story told for the first and last time. This program was videotaped on a set resembling a courtroom, in which various witnesses involved with the rumor were formally questioned by an attorney. This attorney was none other than celebrity lawyer F. Lee Bailey, shown here holding a picture of his most infamous client, Albert DeSalvo, also known as the Boston Strangler. RKO's Paul is Dead special was syndicated on Thanksgiving weekend of 1969. After the broadcast, every videotape of the program vanished forever. Fortunately, the soundtrack was preserved for posterity by an anonymous Beatle fan who taped it off his television set.
Bailey's first witness was this man, the disc jockey whose call-in talk show introduced the Paul is Dead rumor to the airwaves.
Would you tell us your name, please, sir?
Russ Gibb.
And where do you live, Mr. Gibbs?
Detroit, Michigan.
And what is your occupation?
I'm a disc jockey on an underground radio station called WKNR-FM.
Calling your attention to the 12th day of October of this year, 1969, Mr. Gibbs, in the afternoon, were you on duty and on the air?
Yes, sir.
And did you receive a phone call from a listener about Paul McCartney, the Beatles singer?
Yes, sir, I did.
I draw your attention now to this reel of tape before me on the recorder and ask you if you can identify it.
It looks like the tape that was taken off our log. We have to log all programming.
Does it reproduce the conversation about McCartney?
Yes, sir.
Yeah, hello, Tom. What's going down?
Well, I go to school at...
Have you got your radio on?
yeah, something.
Yeah, turn it out, man, because you're going to feedback.
I was going to rap with you about McCartney being dead, and what is this all about?
20 miles away, a sophomore at the University of Michigan at Ann Arbor happened to be listening to Russ Gibbs' talk show that afternoon.
May we have your name, sir?
My name is Fred LeBour.
And where do you live?
Ann Arbor, Michigan.
What is your occupation, please?
I'm a student there at the university.
Fred LeBour was scheduled to write a record review for the next issue of the university's student newspaper. Instead, inspired by what he had just heard on the radio, he sat down at his typewriter and spent 90 minutes composing a masterpiece of engineered mythology.
Are you the same Fred LeBour who published on October 14th, 1969, an article in the Michigan Daily, a newspaper published by the university, which begins as follows? Paul McCartney was killed in an automobile accident in early November 1966 after leaving EMI recording studios tired, sad, and dejected.
Right, I wrote that story.
Do you know for a fact that that's true?
No, I don't.
Well, why did you publish it?
Well, I was supposed to... They asked me to review Abbey Road, which was the current Beatle album. So I decided I didn't want to just write a review about, this is Paul does this song and George does this song, etc., like all reviews go. So I decided to make it work symbolically on a religious level.
Fred's article presented for the first time what was to become the definitive urban legend of Paul McCartney's death. According to Fred, Paul had been decapitated in a car accident early in November of 1966. The Beatles, conspiring to conceal his death, held a look-alike contest and hired the winner, a Scotsman named William Campbell, to replace him. The newspaper containing Fred's article appeared on the Ann Arbor campus early on Tuesday morning. By noon, every copy was gone. 2 press runs followed. The entire campus ground to a halt. As the week progressed, Fred's story spread rapidly eastward, leaping from campus to campus, dormitory by dormitory. And on Saturday night, a student named Louis Yeager at Hofstra University called Alex Bennett's popular talk show on WMCA and informed the city of New York that Paul McCartney was dead. At first, the mainstream news organizations didn't want to touch the rumor without more evidence. A disc jockey on WABC in New York was fired for talking about it on the air. And the publicity department of Apple Records was flooded with phone calls inquiring about Paul's health. And where was Paul while all this was happening? On vacation with his family, on his farmhouse in a remote corner of Scotland. And when the Beatles' chief publicist, Derek Taylor, called Paul to beg him for a public appearance, or at least a statement to quell the rumor, Paul, who you will recall had been through this already 2 years before, instructed Mr. Taylor to ignore the press and leave him alone. And so, the media, having no way to verify or dispel the rumor, had no choice but to acquiesce to the public demand for information and began, skeptically, to cover the story. Within days, the Paul is dead rumor became an international sensation.
Articles appeared in every leading newspaper, including the New York Times, the London Times, the Chicago Sun-Times, the Los Angeles Times, Billboard, Variety, and the Washington Post. Time magazine devoted a feature essay to the subject. An instant cottage industry sprang up to support the hysteria. Special Paul is Dead magazines appeared on newsstands and were snapped up by the hundreds of thousands. At least 4 different Paul is Dead novelty songs were quickly recorded and released, with titles like Brother Paul, The Ballad of Paul, We're All Pallbearers, and a number called So Long Paul, written and recorded under the pseudonym Warbley Finster by Jose Feliciano. Polydor Records exploited the scandal by repackaging one of their early Beatles collections with a suggestive new album cover.
And not surprisingly, sales of the Beatles records and licensed merchandise, especially their new Abbey Road LP, went through the roof, with frantic dealers selling the back catalog directly out of the shipping cartons. Now, celebrity death rumors were nothing new in 1969. Bob Dylan had been the subject of a similar rumor just a few years earlier. What was it about this rumor that made it so persistent? Why were Beatle fans so convinced that something awful had happened to Paul? The answer to this question is what makes this issue so interesting to game designers. Beatle fans believed that clues signifying the fact of Paul's death had been concealed on the record covers and in the songs by the surviving Beatles. This is the defining feature of the Paul is Dead phenomenon. Many lists of these so-called death clues have been compiled over the years. Some of them contain hundreds of entries. For the purposes of this lecture, I have concentrated on the classic suite of clues, the ones most often cited by the press at the time of the scandal. Clue hunters initially concentrated their attention on 4 albums. Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band, released in June of 1967. The soundtrack to the Beatles' TV special, Magical Mystery Tour, released in December of '67. The double so-called White Album, released in November of '68. And the soundtrack to the Beatles' animated film, Yellow Submarine, released in January of '69. The list of suspects quickly expanded to include Abbey Road, released just as the scandal was erupting in September of '69. Now, the tools we have for analyzing the images and sounds on these records were unimaginable in 1969. Nevertheless, in one important respect, those dormitory detectives were better off than we are, because they didn't have to squint at 4-inch booklets crammed into skinny plastic cases. They had albums then. Although I am no fan of vinyl, it is hard not to miss the days when records were a rich visual experience. And no album in the history of popular music exemplifies that experience better than Exhibit A. This is not the time or place to reflect on the enormous impact this record made when it was released at the beginning of the Summer of Love. Suffice it to say that nobody had ever heard or seen anything like it before. Someday, perhaps even in our industry, something like this will happen again. Every square inch of Sgt. Pepper's cover was covered with elusive imagery. Among the faces appearing in the background collage were past and present heroes of the 60s counterculture: Aldous Huxley, Mae West, Edgar Allan Poe, Brando, Dylan, Jung, Einstein. And there in the middle, impeccably costumed in the regalia of a turn-of-the-century brass band, stood the Fab Four. Now, this scene was probably intended to suggest a nostalgic village square or a quaint English garden. But in late 1969, Beatles fans looked at this image with its proliferation of flowers, its freshly turned pile of dirt, the 4 wax Beatles dressed in black, and Cassius Clay on the side, dressed as a priest, and saw something different. They saw a burial. A burial that seemed to insistently single out a particular member of Sgt. Pepper's band. A close look at this image shows that one of the background figures, the British comedian Issy Bon, is raising his open palm directly over Paul's head. This gesture, according to the clue hunters, is an Eastern symbol of the presence of evil. They also noticed that Paul is the only Beatle holding a black musical instrument, a clarinet. The other Beatles are holding shiny gold instruments. Another curiosity was discovered in this group of hyacinths in the lower half of the image. They appear to be arranged in the shape of a guitar. The 3 long sticks, resembling guitar strings, reinforce this impression. But this guitar is just a little bit unusual. It's left-handed, like the ones played by Paul, the only left-handed Beatle. Some investigators went even further. They claimed that the guitar flowers had been laid out in such a way as to suggest the outlines of a word. By squinting at it a bit, you can, without too much of a stretch, make out the letters P, A, U, L, question mark. This is one of those things it's almost impossible to stop seeing once somebody points it out to you. Creative clue hunters also found something odd about the bass drum in the middle of the scene. They discovered that if you hold a small mirror horizontally across the center of the drum, a mysterious message appears. I-1-I-X, he die. The characters to the left of he die being variously interpreted as 3 ones, representing the remaining Beatles, or a 1 and a 1 followed by the Roman numeral 9, indicating the date November 9th, the day on which Paul supposedly died.
Underneath the song lyrics, the first ever published on the outside of an album, is another photograph in which Paul again appears to be singled out in a rather unpromising manner.
You're examining now the rear of the album, Sgt. Pepper's.
That's right. There are 4 Beatles on the back, and one's back is facing us. The others are facing us face on. One's back is turned. That's Paul.
The group shot on the inside of the gatefold album was less obviously alarming, but no detail was too small for Fred LeBour.
I noticed that in the photographs on the inside of this album, all of the Beatles appear in some sort of costume, but a sleeve patch on the left arm of Paul McCartney, whom you say is left-handed, has the initials OPD on it. Have you found any significance to those initials?
Yeah, in England that's supposed to be mean it's the equivalent of our DOA, dead on arrival, and it means officially pronounced dead.
The songs on the Sgt. Pepper album also contain disturbing references to an untimely death. One number in particular seems to allude to the car crash which supposedly took Paul's life.
He blew his mind out in a car. He didn't notice that the lights had changed. A crowd of people stood and stared.
Into another album that has been published by the Beatles, I think less than a year ago, called Magical Mystery Tour, and ask you whether there is anything about it that you think backs up your position.
Yeah, there are a lot of clues. On the cover, the 4 Beatles are dressed up in animal costumes with masks on, and it said that the front Beatle is Paul, dressed as a walrus in black, in a crucifixion pose, with his arms out like this. Now, there's a lot of speculation that the walrus is a symbol of death in Roman mythology, in Dutch mythology, in Eskimoan mythology.
Above the costumed figures on the Magical Mystery Tour album is the word Beatles, spelled out in yellow stars of various sizes. Clue hunters somehow determined that a telephone number had been concealed in this pattern, which could be revealed by connecting the larger stars. Depending on which way you hold the album cover, whether you read it forward or backward, and whether or not you use a mirror, it is possible, with a bit of imagination, to see several different phone numbers. The most common candidates were 537-1438 and, reading backwards, 834-7132. Unfortunate indeed were the customers assigned to those telephone numbers in the latter weeks of October 1969, especially those in London's area code. Literally thousands of calls at all hours of the day and night were placed to these numbers by distraught Beatle fans desperate for information about Paul. The London Guardian ran a front-page article about one of the victims who had to have his number changed after the phone rang continuously for a week, with callers asking to talk to Billy Shears, Sgt. Pepper, or asking for directions to the land of submarines. Most of these calls were collect. Those of you who only know the Magical Mystery Tour album in its current compact disc incarnation are being viciously shortchanged. The original LP edition included a 24-page color booklet with photographs taken from the TV special. This booklet was a gold mine for Paul is Dead clue hunters.
Beginning on the inside cover, we find a list of the songs on the album, including the classic psychedelic anthem, I Am the Walrus, composed and sung by John Lennon. However, underneath the title, I Am the Walrus, appears the parenthetical phrase, No, you're not, said little Nicola. The phrase appears again in a cartoon on page 3. Turning to page 2, we find a picture of Paul McCartney sitting behind a desk. In front of him is a rather curious sign that reads, I was. Another shot from the same scene on page 14 shows Paul from a slightly different angle. It just so happens that there is a pointing hand in the recruiting poster just above his head. A hand also appears over Paul's head in this cartoon from page 15. Again in this photo on page 18, and yet again in the photo on page 24.
I should note here that no other Beatle is ever shown with a hand over his head anywhere in Magical Mystery Tour, or for that matter, any other Beatles album.
This 2-page spread shows the band performing the song I Am the Walrus. Clue hunters noticed that Paul isn't wearing any shoes. This was supposed to be symbolic of the fact that corpses in England are buried that way. Paul's shoes are visible off to the side, positioned directly over the page number 13.
Is there anything unusual about the shoes that you can see?
It appears as though they're red stained.
For many Beatle fans, however, the photograph on page 23 of the Mystery Tour booklet was the one that really convinced them that something funny was going on.
Would you examine this photograph of the 4 Beatles dressed in white, each with a flower, and tell me if there's anything unusual that you found about it?
Yeah, Paul is wearing a black rose and the other Beatles are wearing red roses.
And what significance do you attach to that?
The black rose obviously symbolizes death.
The music on the Magical Mystery Tour album contains several additional clues. One of the most famous occurs on side 2, track 2, described here by DJ Russ Gibb.
What other examples, if any, did you find of curious doings on these albums and recordings?
Well, at that point, the switchboard at the station started to light up like crazy, and kids started to call in, but I still had this fellow on the air, and he said to get the Magical Mystery Tour album.
Is this that album?
Yes, sir. This is
what,
the one.
with reference to that album, did you do?
Well, I got out Strawberry Fields, which is a cut on here. And right at the very end, he said, play it. And he said, see if you can hear something in there. And so I play the album, and you hear very distinctly at the end, someone saying, I buried Paul.
Another death reference was discovered in the song I Am the Walrus. During the fade-out at the end, voices can be heard performing the final lines in Act 4, Scene 6 of Shakespeare's play King Lear, The Death of Oswald. But what sounds like a much more specific reference to Paul can be heard by playing this same section of I Am the Walrus backward. This death clue was actually demonstrated in prime time on the ABC Evening News by reporter Peter Jennings.
There weren't many places to hide visual clues on the featureless cover of the White Album, but the music contained plenty of fuel for the controversy.
One of the songs on side 2 contains yet another reference to a serious car accident. Ringo Starr's first composition for the Beatles, a song called Don't Pass Me By, includes a lyric that immediately caught the attention of distraught Beatle fans.
I'm sorry that I doubted you, I was so unfair. You were in a car crash and you lost your hair. You said...
Another oddity on side 2 is in the John Lennon song, I'm So Tired. A few seconds of obscure muttering can be heard between the end of this song and the beginning of the next song, Blackbird.
Give you everything I've got for a little piece of mind.
This muttering doesn't seem to form any recognizable English sentence, but clue hunters who played this groove backward heard something considerably more distinct.
And on side 4 of the White Album, we come to the longest and strangest track ever included on a Beatle album. Revolution 9 is probably the only song in history that has been played backwards more often than forwards. I'll let the composer himself describe it for you.
I had a lot of loops, tape loops, which is just a circle of tape, if people who don't understand it, that repeats itself over and over. Had about 10 of them on different mono machines, all spinning at once with pencils and things holding them.
For Paul is Dead aficionados, Revolution 9 was the motherlode. An entire afternoon could be spent dissecting the clues they claimed to find buried inside this track. But one tape loop in particular captured the imagination of the public and the press in 1969. Today, it stands as the most famous example of backward speech in the history of recorded sound.
Mr. Gibbs, as a result of the suggestion of your listener that Paul McCartney was dead, what, if anything, did you do?
Well, the youngster said, would you play one cut for me on the air forward? And he said, take the album Revolution, and what we call the White Album, play a cut called Revolution number 9, and play it forward.
Number 9, number 9, number 9, number 9, number 9.
He repeats it. And at that point, the kid said, now, play that backwards. And I played it backwards, and man, I freaked. I went crazy because of the fact it says, turn me on, dead man.
This final White Album clue was used by Paul is Dead advocates to silence the skeptics. It's from the John Lennon song Glass Onion on side 1.
I told you about the war is a mean man. You know that we're as close as can be, man. Well, here's another clue for you all. The walrus was Paul.
A few months after the appearance of the White Album, Apple Records released the Yellow Submarine soundtrack. Clue hunters didn't have to look very far to notice the continuation of an all-too-familiar method of singling out Paul. And it happened again on this color photograph, which was included in the Yellow Submarine press kit, and which was widely reproduced by the media.
As I mentioned, the Paul is Dead rumor had already begun to circulate when the Beatles released Abbey Road in late September of 1969. Fred LeBour personally invented many of the death clues traditionally associated with this album.
I hand you a copy of the album published by the Beatles called Abbey Road and ask you to explain what it was there that made you suspect that Paul was in fact dead.
The 4 Beatles are crossing a street called Abbey Road, and they are leaving what appears to be a cemetery on the left-hand side of the album cover. The first Beatle, John Lennon, is dressed in white and with long hair, looks either like a doctor or a minister or even a Christ-like figure, a God-like figure. The next man walking across the street is Ringo, who's dressed as an undertaker. The next man is Paul, who's wearing an outdated suit. He's barefoot, which would suggest a corpse. And George Harrison is wearing denim clothes like he's a grave digger.
What significance, if any, do you attach to the parked Volkswagen with a registration plate on the back?
Well, the license plate says 28 if, and if Paul McCartney were alive today, he would be in his 28th year of existence.
In other words, he would be 27 looking toward his 28th birthday.
Correct. That's correct.
I ask you to reverse the album and tell me whether or not you find anything on the rear of the album that to you is suspicious or appears to be deliberate.
Well, there are 3 dots in the wall up near the top that appear, if a line was drawn between them, it appears to make the number 3, so it would read 3 Beatles.
Would you connect them up as you suggest?
3 Beatles.
And you say that that was intended to be a message that there are now alive only 3 Beatles?
Oh, I don't know if it was intended to be that at all.
But it's evidence that you find persuasive.
Yeah, it's a coincidence in a series of hundreds of coincidences in the albums.
As the hysteria reached its peak in the final week of October, the editors of the world's most respected news weekly decided to get to the bottom of it. And so, Life magazine sent a team of London correspondents and a crack photographer on an unannounced visit to the remote reaches of Scotland. Hoping to avoid detection, the Life team hiked 4.5 miles across cold moors and soggy fields until they approached the farmhouse of the missing Beatle. Alerted by the barking of his sheepdog, Martha, Paul ran out of his barn and started screaming at the reporters for trespassing, threatening them with arrest and physical violence. The photographer, Robert Graham, started taking pictures of Paul's temper tantrum and was rewarded with a bucket of ice-cold water. The Life team then retreated by running away down the road. Sitting in his kitchen a few minutes later, Paul recognized the likely consequences of what he had just done. He jumped into his Land Rover, caught up with the soggy reporters, and invited them in for a warm cup of tea. After a bit of discussion, they cut a deal. Paul agreed to give Life a worldwide exclusive interview on the spot. In return, Robert Graham agreed to give Paul the film in his camera. A few days later, the Paul is Dead affair reached its climax when a remarkably lifelike Paul appeared with his family on the cover of Life magazine in one of the biggest selling issues in the magazine's history. The accompanying article presented a cynical analysis of the death clues, along with a statement from Paul in which he summarily dismissed the clues and declared that the whole matter was, quote, bloody stupid. Now, you might think that this authoritative appearance by Paul McCartney would be enough to make the whole Paul McCartney issue dry up and blow away. It wasn't. The Life article was indeed enough to convince most people that Paul was still alive. But what about those death clues? Who put all those creepy artifacts on the album covers and in the songs? Why was that stuff in there? Or maybe it wasn't in there at all. Maybe we were just deluding ourselves. Or maybe somebody was having a bit of fun and making a bit of money at our expense. And so the focus of the controversy shifted from a concern for Paul's well-being to a debate about the origin and significance of the clues, a debate which continues to this very day. The fact is, we clue hunters were enjoying ourselves far too much to allow the bothersome fact of Paul's existence to discourage us. Not even that Spoil Sport Life article was exempt from our tireless scrutiny. Was it a coincidence that the final photograph in the Life article showed Paul with yet another hand over his head? And what about this advertisement for the 1970 Ford Marquis on the inside of the front cover? Observe, if you will, that when you hold this page up to a light, the image of the car runs through Paul's body and the top of his head gets cut off. Now, the Beatles have consistently denied any deliberate attempt to include secret messages of any kind on or in their albums. And Lucy in the Sky with Diamonds does not stand for LSD. It doesn't. The mountain of documentary material that has become available to Beatles scholars in the past 30 years generally supports these denials. This material includes detailed accounts and outtakes of the photo sessions used to create the album covers, as well as rehearsal tapes and alternative mixes of many of the relevant songs. Armed with this evidence, most of which had not been made public by the time of the scandal, it is possible to plausibly dismiss many of the so-called death clues. Let's take a look at just a few examples. We now know, for instance, that this was not the only version of the Sgt. Pepper cover photograph. These samples demonstrate a few of the many different poses that were considered. If anybody at this photo shoot was conspiring to position Paul's head underneath the raised hand in the background, they weren't doing a very good job of it. To be fair, however, it should be noted that despite the existence of these alternative poses, the original intention of the album designer, as indicated on this early sketch, was to have the Beatles neatly lined up behind the bass drum as they appeared on the final version. The back cover photo, showing Paul facing away from the camera, was also photographed with several different poses. This villainous arrangement of flowers here looks like a guitar for a very good reason. It was supposed to. This is the voice of Peter Blake, designer of the Sgt. Pepper album cover.
Things happened like there was a young boy who was helping who said, "Oh, could I do a guitar in hyacinths?" And it was such a nice sort of gentle, sweet idea that we said, yes, certainly. So this sort of white shape at the front is actually a guitar. One of the myths that rose was that you can read that as P-A-U-L ? When the stories of Paul's death were rife, this was a sign that Paul had indeed died. But of course it was never intended to be P-A-U-L ? It's simply a guitar.
The fevered brain of Fred Laborde invented the arm patch with the initials OPD. Alternative poses of this photograph prove that the initials on the arm patch are actually OPP, an abbreviation for Ontario Provincial Police, the organization which presented the patch to Paul during the Beatles' 1966 swing through Canada. It looks like OPD because a fold in Paul's jacket has distorted the final character. Now, the bit about the walrus in Magical Mystery Tour is easily dismissed. An embarrassment of evidence, both on the album cover and in the TV movie, proves beyond a shadow of a doubt that John Lennon played the walrus, not Paul. But what about that I Buried Paul business at the end of Strawberry Fields? Thanks to an alternative mix of a song included on the second volume of a Beatles anthology published 3 years ago, we now possess conclusive evidence that what John always claimed he was saying is true.
Like that line in Strawberry Fields at the end, I Buried Paul. It doesn't say that, it says cranberry sauce. And it's me going, cranberry sauce, cranberry sauce. So that's what it says.
Cranberry sauce. Cranberry sauce.
Other death clues are not so easily dismissed. It strains credibility to suggest that a hand could accidentally appear over Paul's head 6 times over the course of 4 albums. It seems likely to me that some person or persons in the Beatles organization was going to a bit of trouble to get these poses published. Why it happened, or whether it was intended to mean anything, is impossible to say. It may simply be that somebody noticed the hand that ended up over Paul's head on Sgt. Pepper and decided that it might be fun to turn the accident into a running gag. Whatever the reason, there can be little doubt that this aspect of the controversy may, in fact, have been deliberately engineered. Also difficult to explain away are the Beatles' repeated suggestions that Paul is not the walrus, despite all the evidence to the contrary. First, there's this odd "No, you're not" line that crops up twice in the Magical Mystery Tour booklet. No corresponding line of dialogue occurs in the Magical Mystery Tour TV movie, and no explanation for its inclusion twice is offered anywhere. Why is this phrase being emphasized? And then there's this line in that song, Glass Onion.
Well, here's another clue for you all. The walrus was Paul.
Lennon never offered a clear explanation for this odd lyric. When specifically asked about it in a Playboy interview conducted just a few weeks before his death, he replied, "Well, that was a joke. The line was put in partly because I was feeling guilty because I was with Yoko and I was leaving Paul." Then there's that black flower on this mystery tour photo. Paul offered a curt explanation for this oddity in his Life magazine article. He said, quote, "I was wearing a black flower because they ran out of red ones." At the time of the scandal, the Mystery Tour film had been unavailable for nearly 2 years. It was out of public release until 1974. If it had been accessible, clue hunters might have wondered why Paul believed they had run out of red flowers, when the movie clearly shows him being handed a substantial bouquet of red flowers and then dancing around the room with them during the same song in which he's stubbornly wearing a black one. Are we really supposed to believe that Paul McCartney, the director of the movie, could not have obtained a matching flower to wear in this scene if he really wanted to? Unless one of the Beatles changes their story, we will probably never know the extent to which the Paul is dead rumor was deliberately instigated. The controversy appears to have resulted from a chance combination of old gossip, mischievous in-joking on the part of one or more Beatles, and the fevered imagination of overzealous fans. Now you may be wondering why I showed you all this. Why I spent so much time putting together this little history lesson. The reason is very simple. This silly event, which happened way back when I was a kid, made a really big impression on me. It was so eerie, so deliciously creepy, and so consuming. Clue hunting occupied me and my friends for 6 solid weeks. We spent every school night and entire weekends going over every single square inch of these 5 records. It was all we ever talked about. We destroyed every copy we had, spinning them backwards on our cheap little record players. It drove our parents nuts. "Turn me on, Deadman. Turn me on, Deadman." And they hated it even more when they heard it again on the evening news. I can't remember the last time I had so much fun. And although I didn't appreciate it at the time, something wonderful happened as we scoured these records, backwards and forwards, line by line. We memorized them. Paul is Dead is one of the best games I have ever played. This ridiculous rumor sucked my entire generation into a massively multiplayer game. A morbid treasure hunt in which the accomplices were connected by word of mouth, college newspapers, the alternative press, and underground radio. We can only wonder what would happen if something like this were to happen today in the age of the World Wide Web. Imagine how something like this could get started by accident. Imagine how something like this could be fashioned on purpose. The Paul is dead rumor is a powerful example of a design principle we can use to make our computer games more entertaining. If you walk away from this lecture remembering only one word, let it be this one: constellation. Constellation is usually used as a noun referring to pictures in the sky formed by stars, but I use it as a verb to describe one of the basic functions of human intelligence. Constellation is pattern recognition. To constellate is to apply order to chaos. When faced with any kind of new experience, be it images or sounds or even just a strange idea, we marshal our personal knowledge and experience and project it into the novelty to imbue it with meaning and significance. And what kinds of meaning and significance are we most likely to project? The meanings we expect to see, the significance we want to see. Constellation is, in fact, a form of self-recognition. So what kinds of experiences are most likely to invoke the principle of constellation? The ones with the most novelty. Rich experiences, complex experiences, experiences that encourage you to discover relationships, to synthesize juxtapositions. A record jacket like this isn't going to excite much constellation, but put something like this in front of people, and all kinds of evocative coincidences are bound to happen. Now, why is this useful for us as entertainers? Because that moment when you peer into the mirror of chaos and discover yourself is emotionally powerful. You get a little oomph when you make a connection that way. These little oomphs are what make good stories and good puzzles and good movies so compelling. And those little oomphs are what made the Paul is Dead scandal so much fun. Allow me to demonstrate oomph. Many people believed that the mischievous John Lennon was the Beatle responsible for planting the death clues about Paul. If John did plant the clues, the joke was on him. This is one of the pages from the Magical Mystery Tour booklet. And that is John, wearing a phony mustache. Beside him is a sign which reads, "The best way to go is by M&DC." 13 years to the day after this album was released, John Lennon discovered that the best way to go was indeed by M&DC, the initials of his assassin, Mark David Chapman. That's oomph. How can we use this principle of constellation to make our games better? I don't have to tell you that today's games are beginning to look pretty damn amazing. Every year, the bar gets raised. Higher frame rates, smoother rendering, more plausible use of lighting and sound, more realism. And as processor speeds accelerate and storage capacity increases, our ability to improve the verisimilitude of our world models will get better and better. Unfortunately, there are limits. There are limits to how much time we can invest constructing our worlds. There are limits to how much money we can spend, and there are limits to how many times we can borrow technologies and aesthetics from established games in order to reduce the risk of creating new ones. But even if these limits were to magically disappear tomorrow, we could never hope to approach the subtlety, the nuance, the fine detail that characterize the phenomenon we call reality. And why is this? Because the detail of reality is infinite. This is where constellation can help us. If you want your artificial characters to exhibit a wide range of intelligent-looking behaviors, don't try to program them all yourself, one case statement at a time. You've written enough bugs already. Instead, try what Peter Blake did on the cover of Sgt. Pepper. Throw in some useless particulars. Take a couple of those robot tanks, pick a random direction, and send them scooting off across the playing field for absolutely no reason at all. Sometimes it'll look like an attack, or a feint, or maybe even suicide. Whatever happens, it's bound to be more interesting than having them just sit there circling. And who knows? Maybe some reviewer will rave about your brilliant AI. If you want your virtual worlds to appear deep and rich, don't try to define everything explicitly. You'll never ship anything before Christmas that way. Instead, try what John and Yoko did in Revolution 9. Mix in a little chaos. Select a random game event, something harmless like a distant sound effect, and make it occur according to a regular pattern, also chosen randomly. And watch your players assign their own dramatic significance and tie it all together for you. We didn't know why a hand kept popping up over Paul's head, but it had to mean something, didn't it? And look how far we took this simple, meaningless pattern. Let your players employ their own imaginative intelligence to fill in the gaps in your worlds that you can't afford to close. Chances are they'll paint the chaos in exactly the colors they want to see. What's more, they'll enjoy themselves doing it, but the credit will be yours. In conclusion, I'd like to leave you with just one more death clue. That's it. This is one you won't find in any of the published lists. During the height of the Paul is Dead scandal, my friends and I spent many a solemn evening poring over our Beatle records in hopes of discovering some hitherto unnoticed gem. We were a fairly precocious little gang of nerds, and we were fortunate enough to have access to a cheap little tape recorder. One of our strategies for identifying clues in the songs was rather ingenious. We drew up a list of the suggestive things that you might expect the Beatles to say if they were trying to conceal hints about Paul's death. Ominous phrases like, "Paul is a corpse," "6 feet under," "We know how he died." You get the idea. We recorded these phrases repeatedly on our tape recorder. "Paul's a corpse. Paul's a corpse." Then we spun the tape backwards with our finger to see if the resulting sound matched anything that we were hearing on our Beatle records. You might say it was a form of reverse engineering. At the time, our little experiment didn't reveal any new clues. And after the excitement about Paul died down, we pretty much forgot about it. But a year later, on October 8, 1970, our experiments bore unexpected fruit. I was at my grandfather's house watching the official premiere of a new Beatles song on The Ed Sullivan Show. Now, at the time of the broadcast, the Beatles had already broken up and dispersed. But this was a filmed performance, an excerpt from a Beatles documentary that was about to be released to the theaters. A chill went up my spine as Paul began to sing the soon-to-be-famous chorus of his new song. And why was the chorus of this song so shocking? Because one of the potential death clues that we had experimented with back on our little tape recorder a year before was the simple phrase, "He is dead. He is dead. He is dead." At the time, I believe that Paul had chosen the title Let It Be for his song as a way of making fun of the death rumor, which was already a year old. I mean, it couldn't be an accident, could it? What I didn't know at the time was that Paul's performance of Let It Be had been filmed in January of '69, 9 months before the scandal broke. And have you noticed that on the cover of Let It Be, all the Beatles have white backgrounds except one, which is blood red? Thank you. We're 3 minutes over, but I can take a couple questions before they throw us out. If someone would turn these things off so I can see. Is anyone raising their hand? No? Yes? Good. Go home.